Let's go live now to the independent member for Goldstein. Zoe Daniel joins me. Zoe, thanks for your time. Lots to talk about. I want to talk to you particularly about Myanmar and your concerns there in a moment. I notice you've been issuing calls for sanctions. I'll get to that in a second. But the big news in Canberra today has been this legal advice that government's received. The Prime Minister undertaking another inquiry into Morrison's secret ministries. Do you welcome that step?
Yes, I do, Kieran, and I've been clear on this. I think the Australian public deserves to know exactly what happened, who knew what, when, and exactly what the process was. But I think more to the point, the issue is preventing this from happening again in this way. If there's a case for it, for issues of national security, for example, or a national crisis, fine. But my issue with this has been the transparency and the secrecy around it. And I do think that the Australian public deserves to know and will welcome an inquiry to open that up.
The opposition critical Susan Lee just a few moments ago on this program saying that Mr Albanese should get back to things that matter to the Australian people, like energy prices and so on. But the Solicitor General was scathing in parts. He says, paragraph 46, that the principles of responsible government are fundamentally undermined by the actions that he was providing that advice on, Zoe Daniel. So it was very strong criticism from the Solicitor General as released today.
Yeah, well, I don't think ethical principles should be guided by what you can get away with. There's a question around what's legal, sure, but there's also a question around what's right. And from those that I'm speaking to in my electorate of Goldstein, I think most people don't think what happened was right. So that's the point of an inquiry. I don't entirely disagree with the point about the Prime Minister getting on with his job, and I think he can and should do that. An inquiry can happen in the background while the Prime Minister and indeed others in the Parliament who are not involved in it are doing their work.
Sure. OK, let's move on to Myanmar and this unfolding conflict, as you described it, that's happening largely out of sight of the world. Explain to our viewers what you'd like to see the federal government do in response.
Well, I think there's three things, Kieran. There's targeted sanctions, particularly on the publicly owned or military-owned companies that the Myanmar military government is using to funnel money into the country to buy military jets, weaponry and ammunition to attack civilians. The second piece is potentially to recognise the National Unity Government of Myanmar, which is in effect a government in exile that set up a rebel embassy in Canberra that opened just a couple of weeks ago. And the third piece is humanitarian aid. There are 1.2 million displaced people in Myanmar. There are civilians being murdered by the government. There are people fleeing to neighbouring countries, and the circumstances are desperate. And because of the fact that Western journalists find it very difficult to get in there and local journalists find it very difficult to work, obviously for security reasons, eyes on this are very limited. And I think the international community simply doesn't know what's going on. And this is a country that's right on our doorstep. It's time that we took some serious action, as other countries have done when it comes to sanctions.
Is the government treading carefully, given that the Australian academic Sean Turnell is still in jail there?
Yes, so Australian academic Sean Turnell, who worked for Aung San Suu Kyi, is in jail, as is Aung San Suu Kyi herself. Certainly the problem for the Australian government is that Sean Turnell is being used as a bargaining chip, in effect, by the Myanmar junta. But human rights organisations indicate that with the court system as it is in Myanmar, there's no fairness or transparency over it. He's likely to be sentenced and found guilty regardless of whether sanctions are imposed by the Australian government or not. And meanwhile, this massive disaster continues to unfold, where the US, the EU, the UK, Canada, India, for example, have all imposed sanctions on hundreds of individuals and companies, and the Australian government has not.
Only a few years ago, it seems, we were all optimistic about the future of this country with Aung San Suu Kyi out of house arrest and in a power-sharing arrangement. How did it all come to this?
Oh, Kieran, it's a complete mess. Look, I travelled and reported a lot in my previous life as a journalist in Myanmar in the early 2010s. I covered the release of Aung San Suu Kyi from house arrest. I covered the election of her National League for Democracy to the parliament. But the thing is that as the junta's grip on power has been loosened by the freedoms that people received after that brief opening up in the early 2010s, clearly those who have the power in the military couldn't tolerate it. And of course, what we've seen now is a return to a situation as bad as or worse than it was when the country opened up.
We will stay in touch on that front. And before you go, the Jobs Summit, if we bring our attention closer to home, there was some talk that there'd be a few representatives from the crossbench. What's happening on that next week with how the independents will be represented there?
Yeah, I'm pleased to say that the government has allocated 3 seats for the Senate and House crossbench. So the group of us have come together to negotiate who will be there at what time, and that's aligned with our areas of priority. So not everyone from the crossbench will get a seat at the table, but many of us will, and I will be there for, I think it's half a day on the Thursday. So it is good for the crossbench, when many Australians didn't vote for either of the major parties, to have representation at the table.
Zoe Daniel, independent member for Goldstein, thanks.
Pleasure.